In a Palestine marked by political tensions and deep religious divisions, the echo of John the Baptist's preaching resounded like a trumpet, calling the people to repentance and spiritual renewal. He was a singular prophet, a man who was noted for his boldness and fervor, dressing in camel skins and feeding on locusts and wild honey. His words, sharp as a sword, challenged not only the morality of the people, but also the authorities that oppressed them. At the center of this tumult, Herod Antipas, the Tetrarch of Galilee, was surrounded by opulence and power, but also by deep fear. The atmosphere inside Herod's palace was a mix of celebration and tension. The luxurious celebration, filled with illustrious guests, contrasted with the restlessness that permeated the king's conscience. He found himself in a dilemma, torn between the attraction to his own authority and the growing uneasiness he felt toward the prophet who had dared to question his personal life. John, sentenced to prison, had become an almost mythical figure, his echo lasting in the hearts of those who sought the truth. Herod knew that John's voice was not easily silenced. His words reverberated as a constant reminder that justice and morality could not be ignored with impunity. Meanwhile, Herodias, Herod's wife, harbored a deep resentment toward John. Her anger was fueled by the prophet's public condemnation of their marriage, a union that many considered illicit. The tension between the two central characters, Herod and John, was palpable, a battle between tyranny and truth, between oppression and freedom of expression. Herod's emotional state, although shrouded in pomp and circumstance, was filled with doubts and insecurities. He questioned himself about the weight of his decisions, tormented by the constant presence of the prophet who had challenged his authority. That festive night, as the guests were having fun and music filled the air, a young woman named Salome took the stage, uncertain but determined. Her dance, a spectacle of grace and beauty, captured everyone's attention, especially Herod's. Delighted, he made a reckless promise, offering Salome whatever she desired. Expectation was in the air, and the young woman, pressured by the influence of her mother, Herodias, made a request that would change the course of history: the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Herod, though hesitant, found himself trapped in his own maze of promises and pressure. The festive atmosphere quickly turned into a scene of tragedy as he struggled with his conscience and the desire to please. The moral dilemma he faced became increasingly distressing: sacrifice the life of an innocent man to save his own honor, or defy the wrath of his wife and the expectations of the court. Thus, the stage was set, and the story of John the Baptist unfolded under the shadow of a dance and a promise. The public's curiosity grew as the prophet's fate approached, revealing not only the costs of truth, but also the complexities of human nature in the face of power and corruption. The narrative became increasingly intense, while everyone anxiously awaited the outcome of a tragic story that seemed inevitable. The night stretched on, and the immersive music filled the air with an atmosphere of euphoria. But as the guests danced and laughed, Herod felt increasingly isolated. He watched the scene before him, the glow of the candles reflecting the opulence of his palace, and yet his mind was far from there, caught up in the cutting words of John the Baptist. "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand," echoed in his mind, a constant reminder that his life was not as fair as he would like to believe. "My king, you seem distant," said one of the counselors, interrupting his thoughts. He was a robust-looking man with a well-groomed beard who often served as Herod's advisor in matters of state. "Just worried about the kingdom's affairs," Herod replied, trying to hide the true weight he felt in his chest. He turned to the counselor, forcing a smile. "What do you think of Salome's dance? He's young, but he has great talent." "Without a doubt, Your Majesty. The young woman is a rare gem. But if I may say so, your mind seems to be elsewhere. Joao's arrest weighs on you, doesn't it?" The counselor gave a significant look. Herod sighed, his gaze lost in the crowd. He knew he could not escape John's shadow. The prophet, even imprisoned, had an influence that defied any authority. How could a man of power be so vulnerable? The memory of how John had confronted his relationship with Herodias tormented him. "John is a dangerous man," Herod muttered, more to himself than to his counselor. Your words of power, and it scares me. A man who speaks the truth is not dangerous, but a man who has the power to silence him is. The counselor tilted his head, assessing Herod's expression. What do you fear more, John's truth or his wife's wrath? Herod turned abruptly to face the counselor, the fire of indignation burning in his eyes. You know I can't challenge Herodias. She would not forgive an affront to her honor. And what will you do then? The counselor crossed his arms, challenging Herod to face his own weakness. Allow a man, even if imprisoned, to continue to cast shadows on his throne? Meanwhile, in prison, John the Baptist looked at the sky through the small window of his cell. He was aware that his days were numbered, but his determination did not waver. Loneliness accompanied him, but faith sustained him. He remembered the crowds that came to him, seeking answers, seeking the truth. "Joao, don't you fear death?" asked one of his disciples, who had managed to infiltrate the prison to see the master. "Death is just a passage, my friend. What really matters is the legacy we leave. We live in dark times, and the light must shine, even if it is through one man." John responded with a serenity that left his disciple amazed and distressed. "But you have so many things to do, so many souls to touch. You can't let that happen. I can't control what's not in my hands. What matters is the message of repentance and transformation. If I am called, so be it. The kingdom of God is not limited to one body." That same night, as the party continued, Herodias approached Salome, the young dancer. His expression was a mixture of pride and ambition. "You did well, my daughter. The dancing was magnificent. Now, make the king keep his promise," said Herodias, her voice soft, but with a manipulative tone. Salome hesitated, feeling the weight of expectation. "Mother, what if what I ask displeases the king? What you want is more important than any fears you have. Think about our future, our name. John the Baptist must be silenced. He is a threat, and you have the power to do it." Salome, still not completely convinced, frowned, struggling between her loyalty to her mother and the morality that was beginning to blossom within her. She was a young woman who sought approval, but was also beginning to understand the gravity of her actions. "What if he's innocent?" muttered Salome, shaking her head as if trying to clear away the disturbing thoughts. "Innocent?" Herodias laughed coldly. "Innocence has no place in power. What matters is appearance, and Joao does not conform to it. Do whatever is necessary, my daughter." In Salome's mind, the battle intensified. She looked at the party taking place, the brightness and the music, and then at the dark cell where Joao was imprisoned. A choice was forming before her, and the line between right and wrong began to blur. Tensions increased, and each character's fate began to become irreversibly intertwined. The decisions that were about to be made would not only shape their future, but would echo throughout the region, like the words of a prophet who dared to challenge power. The party continued to vibrate around Herod, but the music now sounded like a distant echo, almost like a warning. He felt trapped in his own celebration, the laughter and dancing around him turning into a deafening cacophony that only intensified his anguish. John the Baptist's words, which were once a simple restlessness in his mind, now turned into a deafening scream, an echo of his conscience that could not be silenced. Meanwhile, Salome remained in a state of confusion. The look of her mother, Herodias, was a heavy burden, an expectation that she felt on her back. As she watched the guests dancing, she felt like a spectator in her own life, caught between the desire to please her mother and the growing doubt about what was really at stake. The image of John the Baptist, suffering and imperturbable in his prison, appeared in her mind as a symbol of integrity that she began to admire, even without completely understanding it. "What do I really want?" she whispered to herself, as the music enveloped the bodies around her in a frenzy of movement and joy. The question seemed to resonate within her, challenging her beliefs and the framework her mother had imposed on her. Herod, upon noticing Salome's dance, saw not just a young dancer, but the embodiment of his own uncertainty. He wondered if the joy she conveyed was real or a mask that hid his mother's manipulation. There was something tragic about the way beauty and innocence were being used as weapons. He did not wish to be remembered as the king who allowed his own family to become an agent of destruction. The moral dilemma he faced became increasingly oppressive. The advisor, noticing the king's uneasiness, suggested, "Your Majesty, perhaps it is time to reconsider this situation with Joao. What he preaches may be a threat, but it may also be an opportunity. You could use this to your advantage." Herod looked at the counselor, a tense expression on his face. "Use it? For what? To gain the favor of the people, or to silence a voice I cannot control? To build an image of benevolence? Free John and show everyone that you are a just king. Fair? How can I be just when the very essence of justice condemns me?" Herod felt increasingly divided. The image of a benevolent king was a facade he didn't know if he could sustain. In prison, Joao continued to reflect on his situation. The faith that sustained him also brought with it a deep pain. He knew his words could cost him his life, but the thought of silencing his message terrified him even more. "What will you do, Master?" asked the disciple, worried about the possibility of an execution. "I will do what I have always done. I will tell the truth. The kingdom of God cannot be stopped, even if I pay the highest price for it." Joao's determination was a flame that burned intensely, even in the shadows of his cell. He knew that no matter what happened, his words had the power to echo beyond his death. Meanwhile, Salome found herself faced with an increasingly agonizing choice. His mother's pressure and Herod's expectation were becoming an unbearable burden. The thought of asking for an innocent man's head began to gnaw at his conscience. The dance that was once an expression of joy now became a symbol of her internal struggle. "If I ask for this, will I be able to live with myself?" Salome questioned, despair growing within her. The voices around her became indistinct, and all she wanted was to escape the dilemma that trapped her in a labyrinth of guilt and ambition. Herod in turn felt that time was running out. Herodias' pressure, Salome's expectation, and John's influence were intertwining into a knot that threatened to strangle his authority. He needed to act, but the choice he faced was not simple. What was at stake was not just his crown, but the very essence of the man he was. The atmosphere at the party became electric. The dancing was interrupted by anxious murmurs as the guests began to realize something was wrong. Salome, overcome by unexpected courage, stood up, determined to make a choice. Her mother's gaze followed her, but the young girl felt that her own voice needed to be heard, even if it was just a whisper. And so, the tension grew, leading everyone to a precipice of decisions that would change their lives forever. The line between right and wrong became increasingly blurred as each character prepared to face the consequences of their actions. Fate waited, merciless and relentless, ready to weave the threads of their stories into a tragic outcome. The room was filled with forced laughter and anxious looks. I, Salome, felt a storm of emotions inside me, a fierce fight between what my mother expected and what my heart was already beginning to understand. Every step I took in the dance seemed to take me away from the innocence of childhood and closer to the responsibility of a choice that could stain my soul forever. The music stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. Herod's gaze was fixed on me, a mixture of expectation and despair. He was not just a king, but a man lost in his own web of power and fear. His advisor's words echoed in my mind. "Show everyone that you are a righteous king. But at what cost? What would this mean for me?" The look of my mother, Herodias, was a burning fire. I could feel the weight of their ambitions on my shoulders, and the thought of asking for the head of John the Baptist was a shadow that loomed ever closer. He was a prophet, a man of faith who spoke truths that many were afraid to hear. How could I be responsible for his death? The image of him, trapped and firm in his convictions, mixed with the image of my mother, determined and manipulative. The conflict within me was agonizing. "What will you do, Salome?" The king's voice sounded like a distant echo, almost unrecognizable. He looked anxious, as if his own life was at stake. I knew the decision was in my hands, and that terrified me. The desire to please my mother was strong, but the idea of sacrificing an innocent man repulsed me. I looked at Herod, looking for a sign that he didn't want this. What would happen to me if I agreed? The image of John, his unshakable faith and courage, appeared in my mind. He was willing to face death for his beliefs. Could I do the same with my convictions? What did I really believe? Salome, do what is right. An internal voice cried out, but what was right? Was it what my mother wanted or what my conscience asked for? The room was full of curious eyes, and I felt their expectations weighing on me. The music started again, but its melody sounded dissonant in my ears. I found myself standing, frozen in the center of the room, while the guests moved around me like shadows. I needed to decide, and the weight of the choice crushed me. Herod looked at me with a mixture of hope and despair, and I realized that he too was trapped in his own trap. The party, which was supposed to be a celebration, had become a courtroom. Time seemed to slip through my fingers. My thoughts were in shambles, and the pressure was building. If I asked for this, will I be able to live with myself? This question echoed in my mind, a mantra that led me into an abyss of uncertainty. John's freedom was no longer just a matter of life and death. It was a question of who I was and what I wanted to become. Herod approached, his gaze intense and pleading. Salome, you are a strong young woman. Don't let others decide for you. What do you want? He seemed vulnerable, as if, at that moment, the choice was in his hands, not mine. My mentor's words echoed. True strength lies in knowing what you want and having the courage to pursue it. But what did I really want? What I desired had become a dense fog, obscuring my vision. John, I muttered to myself, the image of the prophet appearing in my mind again. He had chosen the truth, even though he knew it could cost him his life. And me? Was I willing to choose the truth or take the easy way out, even if it meant sacrificing an innocent man's life? I heard the voices of the guests, but they were mere murmurs amid the storm that was forming inside me. The moral dilemma was becoming a sharp blade, and time was running out. I needed to act, but uncertainty paralyzed me. Salome, make your choice. Herodias' voice cut through the silence, and I felt the pressure of her expectation like an unbearable weight. The desire to please her conflicted with the need to protect my own integrity. And so, in that moment of unbearable tension, I knew I was about to make a decision that would change the course of my life and that of everyone around me. Fate awaited, and I was about to stand at the crossroads between desire and justice, between ambition and truth. The climax was building, and the truth would become the thread that would connect all of our stories. I closed my eyes for a moment, seeking clarity amidst the chaos. The room seemed to spin, and the music, which had previously been a vibrant background, now became a distant, almost surreal echo. I didn't know if what I was about to do would make me a hero or a villain. The pressure of choice became unbearable, as if the air was running out around me. What do you want, Salome? Herod's question reverberated in my mind, and I opened my eyes, looking at him. He was a man who ruled with fear, but in that moment, his hopes were pinned on me. A mixture of empathy and revolt arose within me. My voice was hesitant, but an internal fire began to burn. I don't want Joao to die. The murmur of the crowd grew, a whirlwind of surprises and expectations. Herod looked stunned, his expression changing quickly from relief to confusion. The hall that once seemed like an arena of power now became a scene of human frailty. What do you want then? He insisted, almost desperate. The tension was palpable, and I realized I was at the center of a dilemma that transcended the simple choice between life and death. It was about who I was, about the woman I wanted to become. Herodias' gaze burned in my direction, like a flame that threatened to consume everything around her. I could feel the weight of his expectations, but something inside me rebelled. I couldn't just be a puppet in his plot. Joao's life could not be the price for my submission. I want him to be heard. The words came out of my mouth like a real explosion. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Let him have the chance to speak. May you listen to him. Herod hesitated, but the crowd, intrigued, began to murmur among themselves. The idea of listening to John the Baptist, of confronting the truth he preached, seemed to be an unexpected blow to the king. And deep down, I knew he was also fighting his own demons. The man who presented himself as a strong ruler was actually swaying under the weight of his insecurity. The tension in the air was electrifying, and I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins. The desire to please my mother was still there, but now I saw that true power was in making the right choice, not what others expected of me. "You dare to defy a king?" Herod finally spoke, his voice low but filled with disbelief. I kept my gaze steady, not backing down. "It's not a challenge, it's a search for justice. Joao is not a criminal. He speaks truths that you fear. Let him speak, and perhaps you will find the path to true leadership." The words echoed in the room, and the crowd began to murmur again, but now with interest and curiosity. Even Herodias, who had previously been so firm in her resolve, seemed to waver. The dilemma that had arisen between the three of us was becoming more complex, and I realized that, even if Joao's fate was still in danger, there was a chance that the truth could prevail. Herod looked at me, his eyes reflecting a new mix of emotions: doubt, hope, and maybe even a glimmer of respect. He turned to the now attentive crowd and slowly shook his head. "Bring John the Baptist," he ordered, and the room fell silent. The weight of the decision weighed on all of us. As we waited, my heart was beating fast, and I felt like I had crossed a line. I did not have the power to change Joao's destiny, but I had chosen not to be an accomplice to injustice. The music that once sounded so distant now became a song of hope, a soft melody that enveloped me as we waited. Finally, the doors opened, and Joao Batista was brought into the room, his imposing presence lighting up the room. He looked at me, and in his gaze was a silent understanding. I didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, I had chosen a truth that could resonate stronger than any royal decree. The climax was building, and I knew the full resolution was yet to come. But for now, the internal struggle I faced was turning into a new path, one I was willing to take, regardless of the consequences. The truth was about to be revealed, and I, Salome, was finally taking control of my own destiny. The silence that followed Joao's entrance was almost palpable, as if the room had held its breath in anticipation. He walked slowly, his imposing presence lighting up the room. When his eyes met mine, I felt a rush of relief and hope. There was something profoundly powerful in his silent determination. "Salome," he said, his deep voice resonating in the room, "you put yourself in danger by doing this." A shy smile appeared on my lips, but the reality of what I had unleashed was beginning to infiltrate my mind. What would happen now? I knew that I had challenged not only Herod, but also the very power structure he represented. Herodias' gaze, which was once a blazing fire, now seemed like a storm about to break out. Resentment emanated from her, and I knew the consequences of my actions were yet to come. Herod, in turn, was in a state of confusion and doubt. He looked at Joao, and at that moment, doubt hung over him like a shadow. He didn't know how to react. The crowd, a mass of eager, curious faces, began to murmur again, and John's words were about to be heard. There was a power in his voice, and I felt like he could be the key to the change we all crave. "You have the floor, John," Herod said, his voice still trembling. The way he spoke seemed like an invitation and a condemnation at the same time. Joao took a deep breath, and I could feel the tension in the room increase. "Herod," he began, "you rule with fear, but true power lies in justice and truth. What you do with those who tell the truth does not define your strength, but reveals your weaknesses." Joao's words resonated, and I realized that the choice I had made was not just about saving a life, but about opening a space for a discourse that could transform everything. The crowd seemed mesmerized, and I allowed myself to dream that, perhaps, truth could triumph over fear. As John spoke, I saw Herod squirm in his seat, the expression of a man torn between his position of power and the need to hear the truth he had feared for so long. What I had done was beginning to manifest itself in visible changes around me. The atmosphere was changing. The fear that once permeated the place began to dissipate, giving way to a new form of courage. But it wasn't just the room that was changing. I felt a transformation within me. What once seemed like a risky choice now turned out to be an act of bravery. Looking at Joao, I realized that I had found not just an ally, but a new version of myself. I was no longer the submissive girl, but a woman who stood up to fight for what I believed was right. "John," I said, my voice now firmer, "speak the truth that needs to be heard." He nodded, and in his gaze was silent recognition. What happened in that room transcended our personal situation. It was a moment that could echo across the land, a call to action that could inspire others to rise up against oppression. Herod, in turn, was struggling with the reality of his own actions. The fear that once ruled him now turned into an internal struggle. He could choose to ignore the truth, but the change I had invoked could not be undone. The reactions of the crowd, the voices that were beginning to rise, were signs that something undeniable was in motion. The murmur in the room grew, and as Joao continued to speak, the energy changed. People were starting to come together, to stand up for themselves, not just for me or for John, but for a future where the truth would no longer be silenced. I looked around, realizing that the courage I had found in myself was spreading like a wave, touching the hearts and minds of those around me. It was the beginning of a new era, and although I knew the repercussions of my choice were yet to come, there was a sense of hope that pulsed through the room. I could not have predicted what was coming, but in that moment, I understood that I had chosen not only to defend John's life, but also to embrace the truth that could set us all free. The once tense atmosphere now reverberated with a new sense of purpose. John continued to speak, his words like well-aimed arrows, reaching the hearts of Herod and the crowd. However, even in the midst of this rise of courage, the shadow of John's fate hung over us. I knew that the truths he proclaimed could lead to severe consequences. Herod, still divided, looked at John with a mixture of anger and fear. The crowd was in fervor, but I could tell that Herodias' anger was unabated, and she would not allow the truth to prevail without a fight. When John finished his speech, a reverent silence followed, but soon the murmurs began again. The tension was palpable, and I knew every second counted. However, the story didn't unfold as I expected. Herod, in his weakness, gave in to Herodias' pressure. The desire to maintain his position and avoid a popular uprising was stronger than the strength of the words that echoed in the heart of the room. He did what many leaders do when faced with the truth. He chose the security of lies over the courage of justice. So, with a dark gesture, he ordered Joao to be arrested and, later, beheaded. The pain of that decision was like a knife in my heart. I had dreamed of a future where truth would triumph, but instead, the silence of injustice fell upon us. Joao's head was brought on a plate, and the tragedy was consummated in an inhumane act. The voices that had been raised were silenced, but the essence of what John had said could never be erased. In that dark moment, I realized that divine justice does not always manifest itself immediately or evidently. John's story, although marked by tragedy, also held a powerful lesson about courage and conviction. He had told the truth until the end, even though he knew the price would be high. In his death, he became a martyr, a symbol of resistance against oppression and injustice. His words would echo for generations, inspiring many to speak and fight for the truth, even in the face of adversity. Reflecting on these events, I understood that true strength lies not only in the ability to govern, but in the willingness to listen and act in accordance with justice and truth. Herod and Herodias may have triumphed at that moment, but eternity held a different weight for them. Divine justice, although often invisible, will find its way, and eventually those who oppose the truth will face its consequences. The lesson I took away from that night was clear. The courage to speak the truth, even in the face of danger, is an act of faith that resonates in people's souls. Even if injustice temporarily prevails, the light of truth will never be extinguished. What John taught us all, that justice must be sought and that the voice of truth is a powerful call to action, stands as a beacon in times of darkness. The story of John the Baptist does not end with his death. In fact, it becomes a testimony to the ongoing struggle for truth and justice. Each of us, by finding our voice, becomes part of this fight. And even when oppression seems to win, we know that truth is a force that cannot be silenced forever. The seeds of courage planted in that room will spread, and one day, justice will triumph. As I reflected on the tragic events that unfolded, I couldn't help but feel that there was a profound spiritual lesson to be extracted from the story of John the Baptist. His life and death were a testimony of the courage to stay true to convictions, even when adversity was so relentless. John not only proclaimed the truth, he lived according to her, demonstrating an unshakable faith that connected him directly to the divine. John's obedience to his call, even in the face of death, resonated with a fundamental principle of our spiritual walk: the importance of listening to the voice of God and acting as His will, no matter the risks. This true faith is a light that must illuminate our own ways. In a world often full of uncertainties and injustices, we are often called to defend what is right, even when it puts us in conflict with authorities or social norms. John's history teaches us that by remaining firm in our faith, and when we speak the truth, we can inspire others to do the same. He reminds us that while the result of our actions may not be immediately visible, the seeds we plant can flourish in hearts that transcend our lives. On the other hand, the practical lesson I extracted is that each of us carries the responsibility of being a voice to justice in our daily lives. How can we then apply John's teachings in daily life? We need to become defenders of truth in our family, professional, and community environment. This may mean lifting our voice against injustices we witness, support those who are marginalized, or simply live authentically, according to the principles we believe. Often the act of telling the truth can be a challenge, but it is a challenge we should embrace. In my own life, I realize that the courage of John the Baptist is reflected in every little act of faith that I do. Each time I decide to do what is right, even if it means going against the chain, I am perpetuating the legacy of that man who, even in the face of death, has never abandoned his mission. Finally, looking at the events that unfolded, of course the struggle for truth and justice is a continuous journey. The echo of John's words will not be extinguished. They will resonate in future generations. Thus, we are called to be carriers of this legacy, transforming the pain of injustice into an impulse to action. May we be inspired by John's life, not only in his courage to speak the truth, but also in our determination to live for it, knowing that, ultimately, the light of truth will always prevail over the darkness of oppression.